A billionaire invited his ex-wife to his wedding, expecting her to crumble. He wanted to parade his new life, his new bride, and his staggering success, a final public declaration of his victory. He imagined her standing in the corner, a ghost of a woman, forced to witness everything she had lost. What he never counted on was her arrival, not as a victim, but as the author of a story he never understood. This is the story of how an invitation meant to shame a woman became the very stage on which she reclaimed her power, leaving a titan of industry to face the hollow empire he had built. The Saturday morning light, soft and autumnal, slanted through the bay window of Araya Bennett's Georgetown townhouse, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. At 39, Araya moved with a quiet economy of motion, a grace honed not in a finishing school, but in the trenches of building something from nothing. Her non-profit, Beacon Futures, was her heart made manifest, a thriving organization that provided scholarships and mentorship to first-generation college students. Her life was orderly, meaningful, and deliberately curated. She was sorting the mail at her marble kitchen island, a Vivaldi concerto playing softly from a small speaker, when she saw it. Thick, black cardstock, heavy as a judgment. Her address was written in a calligrapher's shimmering gold ink. There was no return address, but there didn't need to be. She knew the weight of that particular brand of ostentation. With a silver letter opener, she sliced through the seal. The invitation inside was an exercise in minimalist grandeur. Ronan Vale and Sloane Mercer request the pleasure of your company at the celebration of their marriage. The date, the time, and the venue, the Hay Adams, with its commanding view of the White House, were printed in elegant, merciless type. Arya sank onto a stool, the invitation resting on the cool stone counter like a dare. It wasn't a pang of heartbreak she felt. That scar had long since faded into a thin, silvery line. This was the cold, sharp sting of an old insult, a deliberate act of psychological warfare. Ronan didn't do anything by accident. This invitation was a meticulously crafted power play, a summons to witness his final, gilded triumph. Her mind reeled back, not to the pain of their divorce, but to the slow, insidious erasure that had preceded it. They had met at the University of Chicago, two ambitious sparks drawn to each other's fire. He was a brilliant coder with an empire in his eyes. She was a writer, her notebooks filled with observations that sought to distill the chaos of the world into something true. He'd loved her mind, he'd said. He'd loved the way she saw things. The promises had been as grand as his ambitions. We'll build it all together, Ari. Your words, my code. We'll change the world. But as his company, Valion Innovations, had skyrocketed, her world had shrunk. Her writing became a hobby. The manuscript she poured her soul into, a sharp literary novel about ambition and identity, was met with his casual dismissal. She could still feel the phantom weight of the pages in her hands, covered in his red-inked notes. Not critiques, but belittlements. A little navel-gazing, don't you think? Who is the audience for this? You're smarter than this, Arya. He hadn't just disagreed with her work. He had fundamentally disdained it. He'd wanted a strategist, a sounding board, a hostess, a partner, yes, but only in his venture. Her own narrative was an inconvenient distraction. The wound he'd left wasn't abandonment. It was dismissal. It was the quiet, constant message that her voice did not matter. Now, this, an invitation to his wedding, to a high society tastemaker, a woman whose entire brand was reflecting the success of the man she was with. It was a perfectly cast piece of theater. He was showcasing his upgrade, not just in partner, but in the kind of life he valued, one of polished surfaces and public validation. He was inviting her to see the epilogue of the story he'd written after he'd edited her out. Arya traced the gilt edge of the card. For a moment, she considered dropping it into the recycling bin, letting it be buried under newspapers and junk mail. An unanswered provocation was a dead one after all. But as she stared at the imperious lettering, a different feeling began to surface, rising slow and steady from a place of deep, hard-won strength. He thought he was summoning a ghost. He had no idea he was inviting the author. She picked up her phone. "Tessa," she said, when her friend answered, "we need brunch. Ronan's getting married." Brunch with Tessa Quinn was less a meal and more a strategic summit. They sat at an outdoor table at a bustling DuPont Circle bistro, mimosas sweating in the midday sun. Tessa, a razor-sharp political consultant with a wardrobe to match, slid on her oversized sunglasses and took a long sip of her drink. "The Hay Adams, of course," she said, her voice laced with surgical irony. "He's practically getting married on the government's lawn. The man's ego is a national landmark." She tapped the black invitation Arya had placed between them. "So, let's decode this little piece of psychological terrorism. This isn't an olive branch. It's a B-52. He wants me to see his victory lap," Arya said, swirling the orange pulp in her glass. "He wants me to see Sloane, perfect, polished Sloane, and feel diminished. He wants me to see his world, the one he told me my little writing projects weren't big enough for, and regret everything." "And do you?" Tessa asked, her gaze direct. Arya thought for a moment, letting the honest answer form. "No, I feel insulted. It's a final attempt to edit my story, to make my life a footnote in his." "Exactly," Tessa nodded, leaning forward. "So you're not going for him. You're not going to give him the satisfaction of a reaction, positive or negative. You're going for you. This isn't about revenge, Ari. It's about closure. It's about walking into the arena he built to shame you and showing him and yourself that you were never his to begin with." A plan began to crystallize between them, passed back and forth over bites of avocado toast. This would not be about making a scene. It would be an exercise in sublime, unassailable poise. "First, the armor," Tessa declared. "We need a dress that doesn't scream, 'Look at me,' but whispers, 'You can't look away.' Something that says power, not desperation." 2 days later, they were in a private atelier in Georgetown. After trying on a dozen elegant but safe options, the stylist brought out the one. It was a gown of deep crimson silk that fell in a single, fluid column to the floor. It was architecturally simple but devastatingly effective, with a sharp, asymmetrical neckline that framed the collarbone. When Arya put it on, she didn't feel like she was dressing for a wedding. She felt like she was dressing for a coronation of her own making. The color was bold. The cut was confident. It was the antithesis of the muted grays and navies she had worn in her life with Ronan, the colors of a woman trying to blend in. "That," Tessa breathed, standing back, "that is the dress of a woman who owns her own story." Next, Tessa had said at brunch, ticking points off on her fingers, "Your date. You can't go alone. That reads as tragic. You can't go with a random guy. That reads as desperate. You need to go with someone who operates on a higher plane than Ronan. Someone whose currency isn't just money, but substance." The name was obvious. Ezra Wolf. The respected founder of a clean energy behemoth, Ezra was the thinking woman's magnate. He was grounded, brilliant, and utterly unimpressed by spectacle. He and Arya had served on a philanthropic board together for years, sharing an easy rapport built on mutual respect. He was a friend. Calling him felt audacious. But Tessa was right. His presence would signal not that Arya had moved on to another billionaire, but that she had aligned herself with a different value system entirely. When she called him, she was direct. "Ezra, I have a strange and theatrical favor to ask you." She explained the situation without embellishment. He was quiet for a moment. "So, what you're saying is, your ex-husband, a man who built an empire on monetizing distraction, is inviting you to his wedding as a final power play. That's the gist of it. And you want to attend not to play his game, but to respectfully decline the rules," he concluded. "Arya, it would be my honor. What time should I pick you up?" The final piece of the strategy was the most important, the mindset. When you walk in there, you are not Ronan Vale's ex-wife, Tessa had coached her. You are Arya Bennett, founder of Beacon Futures. You are there to connect with donors, to see old acquaintances, and to wish the happy couple a polite, brief, and utterly forgettable congratulations. You will not be baited. You will not engage in drama. Your objective is not spectacle. It's sovereignty. In the week leading up to the wedding, Arya threw herself into her work. She reviewed scholarship applications, the hopeful, brilliant words of the students, a powerful antidote to Ronan's long-ago cynicism. She finalized the seating chart for her own organization's upcoming gala. She was building futures. Ronan was just cementing a merger. The night of the wedding, as Ezra helped her with her wrap, he looked at her, his expression one of quiet admiration. "The dress is a statement, Arya." She smiled, a genuine, untroubled smile. "It's my thesis," she replied. The Hay Adams Hotel was ablaze with light, a beacon of curated splendor against the darkening DC sky. Valets in crisp uniforms moved with practiced efficiency, opening doors to a procession of gleaming town cars. The air itself seemed to hum with the frequency of power and influence. As Ezra Wolf's car pulled up, Arya took a final, steadying breath. This was the arena. Her crimson gown was a slash of defiant color in the sea of black tie conformity. Ezra, handsome and utterly at ease in his tuxedo, came around to open her door. He offered his arm, his touch firm and reassuring. "Ready?" he asked, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Ready," she said, her voice even. They ascended the grand staircase, the murmur of the cocktail reception growing louder. The ballroom was a glittering fantasy of white roses, crystal chandeliers, and shimmering gold accents. It was a room designed to awe, to broadcast a level of success so overwhelming it bordered on celestial, and it worked. For a moment. As they paused in the arched doorway, a subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. It began as a flicker of movement, a few heads turning, then a few more. A wave of whispers followed, a social ripple spreading through the crowd. "Is that Arya Bennett?" "And Ezra Wolf?" Arya kept her gaze level, her expression serene. She was not looking for anyone in particular, yet she felt his eyes on her almost immediately. Across the glittering expanse, she saw Ronan. He was standing with a senator, a glass of champagne in his hand, the very picture of the man at the center of the universe. But as his eyes met hers, the practiced smile faltered. It was just for a second, a barely perceptible crack in the flawless facade. But in that flicker, she saw not triumph, but surprise, shock even. This was not the woman he had been expecting. Beside him, Sloane Mercer, a vision in bespoke white lace, followed his gaze. Her smile, which had been dazzling, became a fraction of an inch tighter, more brittle. She was a master of social calculus. Arya could see her recalibrating the evening's emotional equation in real time. The ex-wife had arrived not in sackcloth and ashes, but in crimson and in the company of a man who represented a different, quieter kind of power. Ezra leaned in slightly, his voice a low murmur in her ear. The temperature just changed. "Let's circulate," Arya said, her tone light. They moved into the room with purpose. People Arya hadn't seen in years, people from her former life, approached them. The greetings were a mixture of surprise, curiosity, and genuine warmth. No one offered pity. Instead, they offered praise. "Arya, my dear, you look radiant," said a silver-haired woman, the wife of a federal judge. "I read about the latest Beacon Futures cohort. Absolutely brilliant what you're doing." "Arya, we must talk," insisted a prominent philanthropist, grasping her hand. "My foundation is looking to partner with an organization that has real impact. Yours is at the top of our list." This was her world now. Her work, her reputation. With every conversation, she wasn't Ronan's past, she was the city's present. She felt Ezra's steady presence beside her, a grounding force. He navigated the social currents with an expert's touch, his conversations with lawmakers and CEOs seamlessly weaving in mentions of sustainable policy and corporate responsibility, subtly reframing the room's definition of influence. Finally, they came face to face with the bridal couple. Sloane's smile was perfectly polished, her eyes scanning Arya's dress with the swift, appraising glance of a connoisseur. "Arya, how brave of you to come," she said, her voice as smooth as cream. "Sloane, Ronan, congratulations," Arya replied, her own smile genuine and untroubled. "It's a beautiful evening." Ronan's eyes, however, were on Ezra. "Wolf," he said, his tone a calibrated mix of cordiality and challenge. "Didn't expect to see you here. I thought we were rivals." Ezra's smile was calm. "I see leadership, Ronan, not rivalry. There's plenty of room for both. Congratulations on the merger." The barb was so subtle, so elegantly delivered, that it took a moment to land. He had just equated Ronan's marriage with a corporate transaction. Ronan's jaw tightened. He looked at Arya, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of the man he used to be, before the ambition had calcified into a need for domination. He saw the woman who had stood beside him, and the woman who now stood before him, and he seemed, for a brief, unguarded moment, to be at a complete loss for words. The script he had written for this evening had just been thrown out, and he had no idea how to improvise. The room continued to buzz, but the frequency had changed. Arya was no longer the subject of speculative gossip. She had become a center of gravity in her own right. As dinner was served, she and Ezra were seated at a table with several major donors to the city's arts and education scenes, people whose respect was earned through action, not acquisition. The conversation naturally turned to philanthropy. Sloane, making her rounds, paused behind Arya's chair, placing a perfectly manicured hand on the back of it. "It's so wonderful what you do with your little foundation, Arya," she said, her voice pitched just loud enough for the table to hear. "It's so important for women to have a passion project. I'm thinking of starting one myself, once Ronan and I are settled. Something with rescue puppies, perhaps." The condescension was layered and exquisite. Little foundation, passion project, rescue puppies. She had reduced Beacon Futures to a society wife's hobby. The table went quiet. Ezra's hand stilled on his water glass. Arya didn't turn around. She simply took a sip of her wine, paused, and then spoke to the table at large, her voice calm and clear. "Beacon Futures has a $30 million operating budget and has sent over 400 students to Ivy League and flagship state universities. It's more than a name and a checkbook. It requires a P&L statement, a board of directors, and a 5-year strategic plan. But the puppies sound lovely, Sloane. I'm sure they'll be very grateful. A perfectly timed beat of silence, and then one of the donors, a formidable older woman named Eleanor Vance, let out a short, sharp laugh. Well said, my dear. Impact isn't a hobby. Sloane's smile froze. She had tried to land a punch and had instead walked into a steel beam. With a clipped, "How wonderful for you," she glided away. Her retreat, as graceful as her attack, had been clumsy. From across the room, Arya saw Ronan watching the exchange. He wasn't angry. He was intrigued. He was watching her command a space not with volume or drama, but with the quiet, unshakable authority of someone who knows her own value. It was a language of power he understood, but one he had never heard her speak so fluently. His control over the narrative was fraying at the edges. Later, Eleanor Vance cornered Arya near the towering floral arrangements. "My dear girl," she said, her eyes sharp and knowing. "I knew you when you were with him. You were like a brilliant light under a lampshade. Now look at you. You're the real success story in this room." The words landed with a warmth that spread through Arya's chest. It was a reframing of the entire power map of the evening. Success wasn't the man with the billion-dollar company and the trophy wife. It was the woman who had built a legacy of her own, on her own terms. The first dance was a carefully choreographed affair, Ronan and Sloane moving like marionettes under the spotlight. Arya watched for a moment, feeling a strange, clinical detachment. There was no pain, no nostalgia. She was simply observing a performance. Ezra leaned over. "Would you care to dance?" he asked. "I'd love to," she said. He led her to the floor, as the music shifted to something slower, more classic. He was a confident, understated dancer, and she felt herself relax in his arms. They moved with an easy grace, two people comfortable in their own skin. They didn't need a spotlight. As they danced, she saw Ronan watching them. His gaze wasn't possessive or jealous. It was something more complex. It was questioning. He was the host of this lavish spectacle, the king in his castle, and yet for the first time, he seemed to be wondering if he was in the right story. The invitation had been a power play, designed to put Arya in her place. But as she moved across the floor with Ezra, elegant and serene, surrounded by a quiet hum of respect, it was becoming increasingly clear that her place was somewhere he could no longer reach. The pressure he had intended for her was now squarely on his own shoulders. As the night wore on, the grand ballroom began to feel overwarm, thick with the scent of roses and champagne. Arya, needing a moment of quiet, slipped through a set of French doors onto a deserted balcony. The crisp November air was a welcome shock to her senses. Below, the lights of Washington, D.C. spread out like a field of scattered diamonds, silent and serene. She leaned against the cold stone balustrade, the city's hum a soothing counterpoint to the orchestrated revelry inside. She had done it. She had walked into the lion's den and discovered it was just a gilded cage. She felt a sense of calm, of quiet victory that had nothing to do with one-upmanship and everything to do with self-possession. The click of the door behind her made her turn. It was Ronan. He closed the door gently, encasing them in a bubble of relative silence. He wasn't wearing his tuxedo jacket anymore, and his bow tie was slightly askew. For the first time all night, he looked less like an icon and more like a man. "I saw you leave," he said, his voice softer than she'd heard it in years. He walked over to stand beside her, not too close, leaving a respectful distance between them. He stared out at the city skyline. "It's a beautiful wedding, Ronan," she said, her tone neutral, polite. He gave a short, humorless laugh. "It's a beautiful production Costs more than the GDP of a small nation. We hit all our marks. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes searching her face. You look incredible, Arya. Not just the dress. You seem solid, rooted. I am, she said simply. He nodded, turning back to the view. I have to admit, I didn't know what to expect when I sent that invitation. Part of me, the worst part I guess, wanted to show off, to prove something. Prove what? She asked, genuinely curious. That I won, he said, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. That this, he gestured vaguely back at the glittering ballroom, was the right choice. That leaving, that letting you go, was the price of admission for all of this. He paused, his hands gripping the balustrade. But watching you tonight, talking to Eleanor Vance, seeing you with Wolf, I have all of this, and it feels hollow. It's an acquisition, a successful one. But it's not a life. It was a confession of profound, startling emptiness. The great Ronan Vale, the titan of innovation, the man who had everything, was admitting it was all just scenery. The old Arya might have felt a surge of pity, or perhaps a sharp, satisfying sting of vindication. The woman standing on the balcony now felt something far quieter, a sense of clarity. My life has meaning, Ronan, she said, her voice gentle but firm. The work I do, the people I help, that's my metric. It fills me up. It's real. She looked at him, her gaze unwavering. You didn't let me go. I left. I left because the life you were building didn't have room for the one I needed to live. Your choices were your own. They have nothing to do with me anymore. The stakes of the evening inverted in that moment. The invitation, his grand, opulent trap, had failed spectacularly. It hadn't diminished her. It had only served as a backdrop against which her own substance shone more brightly. And in doing so, it had thrown the stark emptiness of his own choices into sharp relief. He had brought her here to witness his victory, and instead, she had forced him to confront his own profound void. He looked at her, a decade of ambition and regret warring in his eyes. You were the one thing I couldn't quantify, he whispered, more to himself than to her. Your writing, I didn't get it. I didn't know how to measure it, how to scale it, and it scared the hell out of me. You don't have to scale everything, Ronan, she said. Some things you just have to feel. A gust of wind swept across the balcony, and Arya pulled her wrap tighter. The moment of confession was over. She had given him a truth he wasn't expecting, and had held a boundary he didn't know how to cross. She was no longer a variable in his equation. She was her own, complete universe. Returning to the ballroom was like re-entering a different dimension. The orchestra was playing a lively swing number, and the energy was high. The raw honesty of the balcony felt a world away. Arya saw Ezra by the bar, talking to an ambassador. He caught her eye and gave a small, questioning smile. She smiled back, a signal that all was well. She felt lighter now, as if she'd finally set down a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying. The rest of the evening passed in a pleasant haze. She deflected passive-aggressive questions from old acquaintances with grace. She accepted compliments on behalf of her organization. She watched as Sloane tightened her grip on the evening's optics, her smile never wavering, a masterclass in social endurance. As the cake was being cut, a towering, 8-tiered confection that looked more like architecture than dessert, Arya knew it was time to leave. She and Ezra made their way towards the exit, offering quiet goodbyes to the people at their table. They were almost at the door when Ronan appeared at her side. Sloane was occupied, trapped in a circle of admirers. "Arya, wait," he said. She turned, Ezra pausing a few feet away, giving them space. Ronan looked exhausted, the weight of the production pressing down on him. "What I said out there, I meant it," he said, "and I'm sorry. Not for the divorce. We were on different paths. I'm sorry for the way I treated your work, for making you feel small. That was my failure, my lack of imagination. Not yours. It was the apology she had never known she needed." Hearing it now, it wasn't a cathartic explosion, but a quiet, settling piece. It was the final piece of the story falling into place. "Thank you, Ronan," she said, and she meant it. "I forgive you." She paused, then clarified, "for both their sakes. But more importantly, I've forgiven myself, for ever believing I needed your approval to begin with." She extended her hand. It was a formal, almost corporate gesture, but it felt right. A handshake truce, an acknowledgement of a shared history and a definitive closing of the book. He took her hand, his grip firm. "Be well, Arya. You too, Ronan. Congratulations again." And with that, it was over. She turned and walked towards Ezra, who had been waiting patiently. He held the grand door open for her, and they stepped out of the glittering ballroom and into the crisp, clean night air. As they waited for the car, Arya looked up at the star-dusted sky. The weight of her crimson armor seemed to dissolve, replaced by an incredible lightness. She had walked into her past and walked out freer than she had ever been. She hadn't needed to tear Ronan down to build herself up. She had simply shown up as the woman she had become, and that had been more than enough. The valet brought Ezra's car around. He opened the door for her, and as she slid in, he looked at her. "Closure?" he asked softly. Arya smiled, a real, unburdened smile that reached her eyes. "And then some," she said. "It feels like a new beginning." As the car pulled away from the curb, leaving the opulent glow of the Hay Adams behind, Arya knew with absolute certainty that she was no longer a character in Ronan Vale's story. She was on the first page of her own. The following morning, Arya was at her desk before the sun had fully risen, a mug of steaming black coffee beside her. Her office, which overlooked her quiet walled garden, was her sanctuary. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't thinking about fundraising strategies or board meetings. She opened a new document on her laptop, the cursor blinking on the blank white page. She began to write. It wasn't her memoir, not yet. It was an essay, the words flowing with a clarity and ease she hadn't felt in years. She wrote about resilience, not as the act of bouncing back to a former shape, but as the act of being reshaped by pressure into something stronger, more authentic. Her tone was clear, incisive, and completely devoid of bitterness. She wrote about the seductive danger of letting others define your success, of accepting a narrative that silences your own. It was the essay she had been trying to write a decade ago, but she hadn't had the perspective then. She had been writing from the wound. Now she was writing from the scar, a place of healed strength. Later that week, seeking a rare hour of unstructured time, Arya found herself browsing the shelves of her favorite independent bookstore near Dupont Circle. She was in the biography section, her fingers ghosting over the spines, when a voice behind her spoke her name. "Arya?" She turned. It was Sloane Mercer, dressed not in couture, but in simple, elegant jeans and a cashmere sweater. She looked younger, more vulnerable. The polished armor of the wedding was gone. "Sloane," Arya said, her voice even, surprised. I wanted to apologize," Sloane said, her gaze dropping to the floor for a moment before meeting Arya's again. "For what I said at the wedding, about your foundation. It was petty and condescending, and I was out of line." Arya was taken aback by the directness of the apology. "Thank you. I appreciate that. Sloane gave a wry, self-deprecating smile. The truth is, I was intimidated. You walked in there so self-contained. You have this thing you built, this purpose. Everyone in that room respects you for who you are, not who you're with. She gestured vaguely with her hand. My entire life has been about who I'm with. My value has always been reflective. And I saw you, and I saw a different way of being, and it made me feel insecure. So I lashed out. It was ugly. In that moment, Arya saw her not as a rival or a symbol, but as a person. Another woman navigating a world that set impossibly high standards. There was no triumphalism in this encounter, no sense of victory. There was only the quiet, startling truth of two women seeing each other beyond the roles they had been assigned. It takes a lot of courage to say that, Arya said honestly. Thank you. Sloane nodded, a flicker of relief in her eyes. Ronan, he talks about you sometimes, she admitted. Not in a romantic way, but like you're a question he never figured out how to answer. We were a question we never figured out how to answer together, Arya replied. They stood in a comfortable silence for a moment, the scent of old paper and ink around them. It was a mutual release, an unspoken acknowledgement that their stories were not in opposition. They were simply different books on the same shelf. Well, Sloane said finally, I should go, but I'm glad I saw you. Me too, Arya said. As Sloane walked away, Arya felt a final, quiet click of resolution. She had not only made peace with her past, she had found a moment of unexpected grace with its present. Her world was expanding in ways she could never have predicted. The Beacon Futures annual gala was the culmination of Arya's year. Held in the soaring, modern atrium of the National Portrait Gallery, it was an evening dedicated to celebrating the students, not the donors. The room was filled with a vibrant mix of DC's philanthropic elite, corporate sponsors, and the bright, hopeful faces of the scholars themselves. This year, the board had decided to present Arya with a special Social Impact Founders Award. When her name was called, she walked to the podium, the applause warm and genuine. She looked out at the faces, her team, her board, the students whose lives she had touched, and felt a wave of profound gratitude. There are many ways to measure a life, she began, her voice steady and clear. We can measure it in dollars, in headlines, in the square footage of our homes, or we can measure it in the number of doors we are able to open for others. For years, I worried I was using the wrong ruler, that my metric for success was flawed. But standing here tonight, surrounded by the next generation of leaders, thinkers, and innovators, I know that building your own metric of success is the most powerful act of all. Success is not an empire you build for yourself. It is a horizon you expand for everyone. The speech was a public declaration of her values, the thesis of her life, delivered not in a defensive crouch, but from a position of undeniable strength. As she returned to her table, Ezra squeezed her hand under the table, his eyes shining with pride. A few days later, a package arrived at her office. It was a sleek, black box with the Valion Innovations logo embossed in silver. Her first instinct was apprehension, but she opened it. Inside, nestled in black foam, was a worn, leather-bound notebook and a handwritten card. It was Ronan's old ideation notebook, the one from their early years together, filled with his frantic scrawls, diagrams, and algorithms, the primordial soup from which his empire had emerged. The note was brief. Arya, I was cleaning out an old storage unit. Found this. I'd forgotten how many of your ideas are scribbled in these margins. Your questions, your insights on human connection. They were the unseen scaffolding for everything that came after. Valion wouldn't exist without them. I lacked the courage to choose the partnership over the project. That was my failing. Thank you for being the better part of its origin story. Ronan. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened the notebook. Tucked into a page near the middle was a folded sheet of paper. On it, he had written 2 words, Valion and Arya. He had circled Arya. It was a ghost of a choice, a road not taken. A path where he had almost chosen the relationship, the partnership, but had ultimately lacked the courage. She closed the book, a slow smile spreading across her face. There was no longing, no regret. There was only a profound sense of gratitude. He had finally given her the credit she was due, not because she needed it anymore, but because he needed to give it. He had reframed their past. It was not her failure to fit into his world, but his failure to be brave enough to build a bigger one with her. The notebook wasn't a relic of a lost love. It was an artifact of her own quiet, foundational influence. It was proof. The meeting was at the Penguin Random House headquarters in New York. Arya sat across a sleek conference table from Dana Whitfield, a legendary editor-in-chief with a reputation for spotting stories that mattered. Arya had sent her the essay on resilience, along with a proposal for a memoir tentatively titled Finding Horizons. Dana, a woman with sharp eyes and an even sharper mind, tapped the manuscript. "This isn't a book about a divorce, Arya," she said, her voice decisive. "This is a book about the architecture of a meaningful life. It's about building something of value when the world is telling you to invest in shiny surfaces. Your voice is exactly what readers are looking for right now. We want to buy it. A green light, a book deal." The words she had once been told were a hobby were now being validated at the highest level. Her voice, the one Ronan had dismissed, was about to be heard by the world. That night, she celebrated. Not at a flashy 4-star restaurant, but at a cozy Italian place in her own neighborhood. The table was small, filled with the people who formed the true foundation of her life. Tessa, Ezra, and 2 of her senior staff from Beacon Futures. They raised glasses of Prosecco, their laughter filling the small room. "To the author," Tessa toasted, her eyes shining. Arya looked around the table, her heart full. This was her victory. Not the silent awe of a ballroom full of strangers, but the loud, joyful celebration of people who truly saw her. The following weekend, Ezra drove them out to Shenandoah. The air was cool and clean, and the rolling mountains were painted in the fiery colors of late autumn. They hiked for hours, speaking little, content in a shared, easy silence. At an overlook, with a breathtaking vista of the valley spread below them, they stopped. Ezra turned to her, his expression serious but gentle. "You know that night at the wedding," he began. "I went as your friend, to support you. But watching you navigate that entire evening with such grace and strength, I realized my feelings run a bit deeper than friendship." Arya's heart gave a hopeful leap. "Mine too," she admitted softly. He smiled, a slow, wonderful smile that transformed his face. He stepped closer and cupped her face in his hands, his touch warm against her cool skin. He kissed her, and it was nothing like the frantic, ambitious kisses of her past. It was calm, sure, and full of a quiet promise. It felt like coming home. "Living fully," he whispered against her lips, without fear of the past. That Sunday evening, back in her study, Arya sat down to write. The framed letter and notebook from Ronan sat on a nearby shelf, not as trophies, but as simple, settled artifacts of her growth. The desk lamp cast a warm glow on the page. She typed the title and then the first line of Chapter 1. The most important journey isn't the one that takes you to the furthest corners of the globe, but the one that brings you, finally, back to yourself. She paused and looked out the window at the DC skyline, now bathed in the golden light of sunset. The horizon was wide open, vast, and full of possibility. She whispered the words into the quiet of the room, a promise to herself. Still writing, on my terms, Arya's story reminds us that the most powerful narrative is the one we write for ourselves. True success isn't about winning someone else's game. It's about having the courage to create your own. She didn't need revenge. She just needed to own her truth. What did you think of Arya's incredible journey of self-reclamation? Let me know in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about turning life's greatest challenges into your greatest triumphs. Thanks for watching.